Well, back here in Minnesota, new laws have gone into effect and a few crimes have been upgraded to felonies. Aaron Stuvey has more on the changes and what they mean for law enforcement.
August 1st saw many new laws go into effect in Minnesota, including some on the law enforcement side. Alongside the new child car seat laws, there are a number of crimes that are being upgraded to automatic felonies. Swatting is the act of making false emergency calls in an attempt to send a police presence to someone's residence. Previously, the charges were a misdemeanor for the call itself, a gross misdemeanor if emergency services are actually deployed, and a felony if someone was injured in the incident or if it was a repeat offender. Now the crime is automatically upgraded to a felony if the victim is an elected official, a judge, prosecutor, or a member of law enforcement. Swatting is not unheard of in the local area, with the highest profile cases coming in Lake Crystal and Mankato West High School, both in 2022.
At a local level, we don't see a lot of it, but there's been a few incidences where we've had some different calls come in that would be eliciting a response of one form or another from law enforcement or emergency services in our area over the last couple of years.
The new laws also upgraded the charges for straw purchases, or buying weapons for people who can't legally purchase them themselves. Law enforcement leaders say that the law is always evolving and that there's a long process to get things put into legislation, especially in response to ever-evolving technology.
Technology moves very, very fast. The legislature, law enforcement, and its response has to be calculated in response to what the technology is doing.
Aaron Stuvey, KUIC News Now.